It was a tough fight for control in Asia. Japan had angered the US, which led to the war in the Pacific. Now, the Second World War was happening all over the planet. The two countries, both with strong navies, fought each other on the world's biggest ocean in battles larger than any seen before. The US had to move its troops and supplies across thousands of kilometers to win back the parts of Asia that Japan controlled. It was a fight for every single island, and even though airplanes were very important at the time, it was the soldiers on the ground who really bled for every victory, both on the beaches and in the jungle. On December 7, 1941, radio and TV shows in America were cut off for a special report. Japan had attacked the American military base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii without any warning. The Second World War had just entered a new, more serious stage. Japan had signed a deal with Hitler and was facing strong economic punishments. It was only a matter of time before the Japanese Empire and the US would be at war. The military leaders in Tokyo felt the American Navy in the Pacific was a huge threat. In 1940, the U.S. moved its Pacific Fleet to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and that's where Admiral Yamamoto planned to destroy it. On Sunday, December 7, 1941, the Japanese attack group got to its starting position. At 6 a.m., the 6 Japanese aircraft carriers turned into the wind and launched their planes. These were dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighter planes. Just after sunrise, the attackers flew down toward the naval base as it was just waking up. It was 7:48 a.m. A short time later, the first report was sent to Japan's leaders, Tora, which was the secret code for a successful surprise attack. All 8 of the U.S. Pacific Fleet's battleships were tied up in a double line along Ford Island. They were a perfect target. There were 2 waves of attacks. Around 350 planes took part in the Japanese airstrike, which sank 5 U.S. battleships in the harbor. The other 3 battleships, a cruiser, and several smaller ships, were all badly damaged. The Japanese also destroyed 188 American planes at 2 different Air Force bases. Japan itself lost only 29 planes in the attack. As the smoke started to clear over the naval base in Hawaii, it was obvious that most of the American Pacific Fleet was destroyed. More than 2,400 U.S. soldiers were dead. America was now at war. The attack was meant to be a way for Japan to free itself. The empire needed oil and other resources, so it had to keep taking over more land. Under President Roosevelt, the U.S. tried to stop this with economic penalties, and finally, by stopping oil sales. At first, the attack looked like a big success, but it turned out that none of the American aircraft carriers were at the base that day. The U.S. aircraft carriers Enterprise and Lexington were busy taking planes to American bases on Midway and Wake Islands, so they weren't hit in the attack. In 1941, aircraft carriers were a fairly new type of weapon. Before them, battleships were seen as the rulers of the sea. But this symbol of sea power was shown to be almost helpless against much cheaper airplanes. The attack on Pearl Harbor changed the U.S. fleet from one of battleships to one of aircraft carriers. This was a huge change in military thinking that would affect the future. U.S. President Roosevelt called the day of the attack a day of infamy. On December 8, 1941, the U.S. declared war on Japan. A little later, and for no clear reason, Hitler announced that Germany was also at war with America. The Second World War had exploded into a massive global conflict. For the last 10 years, Japan had already been fighting in Manchuria, China, and the Pacific. Japan wanted to make its empire bigger, and to do that, it needed to get its hands on lots of natural resources. The attack on the U.S. fleet was meant to give Japan more time to take over more land and secure its power. The Japanese were expanding their control at the same time they were attacking Pearl Harbor. The Emperor's soldiers pushed the Americans off Wake Island in the Pacific and took over Dutch-controlled lands from the Dutch. Japan was fighting a brutal war to take over more territory, and it looked like no one could stop them. By the spring of 1942, the Japanese Empire was the biggest it had ever been. It was close to having full control over the Far East, and was kicking out the European powers that had been there before. Thailand, Hong Kong, and Singapore were taken by the Japanese in just a few weeks. North Borneo, Indonesia, and the Philippines were the next to fall. In the months after Pearl Harbor, Emperor Hirohito's soldiers swept through the Pacific like a hurricane. "I shall return," promised U.S. General Douglas MacArthur on March 12, 1942, as he was forced to leave the Philippines. In May, the last U.S. soldiers there gave up. Thousands of them died on the way to prison camps. The U.S. had to switch to defending itself. President Roosevelt needed to look strong, so the Americans came up with a bold plan. They were going to strike the enemy in the place that would hurt the most: Tokyo, the emperor's city. The emperor, who was seen as a god, would soon feel their anger directly. On April 2, 1942, the U.S. aircraft carrier Hornet headed for Japan. On its deck, 16 B-25 bombers were tied down. The problem was, these U.S. Army planes weren't made to take off from aircraft carriers, and landing back on the ship was impossible. So after dropping their bombs, they would have to fly on to China. The attack was planned and led by Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle, and it became famous as the Doolittle Raid. On its way, the Hornet met up with the aircraft carrier Enterprise. It was leading Task Force 16, which was protecting Doolittle and his planes. The crew on the Hornet got ready for their mission. They tied old Japanese friendship medals to their bombs as a message to the enemy. After Pearl Harbor, any hope of friendship was gone. On the morning of April 18th, the day of the attack, the fleet ran into Japanese lookout ships. The Americans were able to sink some of these small boats, but they couldn't stop them from sending out radio messages. The U.S. group had been spotted. Doolittle and Mark Mitcher, the Hornet's captain, decided to launch the bombers right away. The first B-25, flown by James Doolittle himself, took off 10 hours earlier than they had planned. The bombers flew toward Tokyo. All the crewmen were volunteers, and they knew what leaving early meant. They wouldn't have enough fuel to reach the safe part of China that wasn't controlled by the Japanese. The surprise mission was a success. U.S. bombs fell on Tokyo. America, the story went, was able to hit back. Most of the bomber crews managed to get to territory not controlled by Japan after the attack, and then they made their way back home. 2 men drowned when their plane had to make an emergency landing in the water. 8 U.S. soldiers were captured in Japan, and 3 of them were executed. Japan's leaders were shocked. The U.S. Pacific Fleet now seemed more dangerous than ever. In the spring of 1942, Chester Nimitz, the top U.S. commander in the Pacific, got a warning from American codebreakers. He sent a carrier group to the Coral Sea. Admiral Yamamoto was planning to attack the Americans in the Central Pacific. The Japanese wanted to set up bases on New Guinea and the Solomon Islands to protect their territory. But the Americans were waiting there to surprise them. This was the first sea battle in history where the fighting was done only with airplanes over a long distance. The 2 fleets never even saw each other. The War of the Aircraft Carriers had started. The enemies launched their planes at almost the same time. They clashed over the Coral Sea. The battle went on for 2 days. The Americans sank the Japanese carrier Shoho and badly damaged Japan's new carrier, the Shokaku. A third Japanese carrier, the Zuikaku, lost almost all of its planes. The Americans took some heavy hits too. The carrier Lexington sank, and the Yorktown was badly damaged. But the Japanese advance had been stopped. With their attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had woken up a sleeping giant that was now angry. In just a few months, U.S. factories switched over to making military gear. A new kind of aircraft carrier was being built to take back power for the U.S., especially in the Pacific. These ships were fast, could travel long distances, and could carry up to 100 planes. The Americans moved group after group of ships to the Pacific through the Panama Canal. And they had a huge advantage because they had cracked the Japanese secret codes. U.S. codebreakers could now read a lot of Japanese messages, which helped them stop more surprise attacks. The next big battle happened at a tiny spot in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, the U.S. naval base on Midway. Japan planned to trick the American fleet into a fight by launching a fake attack on the Aleutian Islands, while also taking over Midway Island. Here, Admiral Yamamoto wanted to finish what he started at Pearl Harbor, the total destruction of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. On June 4, 1942, the Japanese started their attack on Midway. But because the Americans could read their secret messages, Yamamoto's plan was ruined. The Americans were ready for them. The 3 aircraft carriers, Hornet, Enterprise, and the Yorktown, which had been quickly fixed after the Coral Sea battle, were waiting in ambush 300 miles away from Midway. Then, a U.S. plane spotted the Japanese fleet coming. Commander Yamamoto and Admiral Nagumo, who was in charge of the Japanese carriers, had no idea how dangerously close the enemy was. A Japanese scout plane also saw enemy ships, but its radio message, warning that aircraft carriers were nearby, arrived too late. On the Japanese carriers, chaos broke out as they realized the danger they were in. First, Nagumo's planes had to be switched from bombs for land targets to torpedoes for sea targets, and Yamamoto's battleships were too far away to help. But the American attack was also disorganized at first. Almost all of the U.S. torpedo bombers were shot down. But later, dive bombers managed to destroy 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers in just a few hours. These were the Soryu, the Kaga, and the Japanese main ship, the Akagi. In the afternoon of June 4, 1942, the Americans even sank the Hiryu, the last carrier in Japan's attack fleet. Admiral Yamamoto had to give up on his plan and retreat. The Americans were now on the attack. Their next move was supposed to be toward New Guinea, but when U.S. spy planes saw that the Japanese had built an airfield on the Solomon Island of Guadalcanal, that island became their new #1 target. From there, Japanese planes could threaten U.S. supply routes. Controlling the air was key in the Pacific, and the airfield on Guadalcanal was now a very important piece in the game. That's why U.S. commanders ordered their troops to attack the island and take the Japanese airfield. The Americans sent 19,000 Marines to the Solomon Islands. The mission was called Operation Watchtower. Their goal was to push the Japanese off Guadalcanal and the nearby island of Tulagi. But it was a pretty small force for such a big job. The U.S. was fighting a war in 2 oceans at once. The main plan for the Allies was Germany first. Only after Nazi Germany was beaten could all the focus and supplies be sent to the war in the Pacific. The troops didn't know much about the islands. There weren't even any good maps of the area. For most of the 19,000 U.S. Marines who were very young, this was their first time in battle. Further out at sea, Admiral Frank Fletcher protected the landing with a fleet of 3 aircraft carriers and the battleship North Carolina. The operation started in the early hours of August 7, 1942, with ships firing at the coast of Guadalcanal. The Americans didn't know what was waiting for them on the beach. They didn't know if the landing areas were defended or how strong the defenses were. They didn't know how many enemy soldiers would be waiting at the edge of the jungle, or if they would live or die in the next few hours. They had no idea that the battle for Guadalcanal would become one of the bloodiest fights in the Pacific War. At 9 a.m., the 1st Marines landed on Red Beach, which was the name the U.S. planners gave the landing area. They didn't face much of a fight on the beach. The Japanese soldiers defending the island had pulled back into the jungle, where they took heavy losses from the advancing American troops. By the next day, the U.S. Marines had already captured the airfield. They named it Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, who died at the Battle of Midway. Then they went after the Japanese troops. That night, and over the next few days, there were several fierce sea battles. The Japanese sank several American cruisers. The Battle of Savo Island is remembered as the worst defeat for the U.S. Navy in all of World War II. In the jungle of Guadalcanal, soldiers fought in close, hand-to-hand combat. In November 1942, the Marines finally started winning on Guadalcanal. On the other side of the world, big things were also happening. In Stalingrad, Russia, Germany's 6th Army was beginning to be destroyed. The British pushed General Rommel out of Egypt, and as the U.S. drove the last Japanese troops out of Guadalcanal, the Allies landed on the coast of North Africa. The Americans, British, and French worked together to take control of Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria. Hitler was losing control in Europe. In the Pacific, the Americans finally had the chance to go all in against the Japanese Empire. November 1942 was the turning point of the Second World War. By taking Guadalcanal, the U.S. had captured an important base. Their Air Force now controlled the Solomon Islands. But this victory came at a very high price. The Americans lost almost 7,000 men in the battle for the island. The Japanese lost more than double that number. Because of the island's airfield, and without Japan's leaders knowing, it had lost its most important general in the fight for the Pacific. American codebreakers had read a secret message that said Admiral Yamamoto was going to visit his troops. U.S. commanders decided to shoot down his plane. Isoroku Yamamoto, the man who planned the Pearl Harbor attack, was going to be held responsible. The mission was given to a squadron of Lockheed P-38 Lightning planes stationed on Guadalcanal. These planes, known for their two tail sections, were used as spy planes and high-altitude fighters. The codename for the operation was Vengeance, and it began when a group of fighter planes took off on April 18, 1943. The pilots knew where Yamamoto was going, his exact flight path, and his timing. They even knew who was flying with him. The setup for the attack couldn't have been better. After flying 650 kilometers, the American fighters caught up to the Admiral's plane. Isoroku Yamamoto died in a storm of bullets. His plane crashed into the jungle on Bougainville Island, which is one of the Solomon Islands. By killing Yamamoto, the US had taken out one of Japan's most important leaders. After the death of the enemy's top planner, the Americans turned their focus to the Aleutian Islands. This group of empty and not very important islands had been taken by the Japanese as a distraction before the attack on Midway. Ever since, 2,500 Japanese soldiers had been holding out on American land. This was a situation the US could not accept. They sent 150,000 soldiers to the islands of Attu and Kiska, which are between Alaska and Russia, to free them from the enemy. In these battles, more Americans died from the terrible weather than from fighting the enemy. The soldiers sent to the Aleutian Islands were not well prepared or properly equipped. The Japanese defended the islands with incredible fierceness. In a last hopeless attack against the stronger American forces, about 500 Japanese soldiers killed themselves together, following their samurai code of honor. They did this by holding grenades to their stomachs and setting them off. They chose to die rather than be captured. The US troops would see this kind of behavior again and again during the war with Japan, and it led to a very high number of deaths on both sides. The fights for the islands of Attu and Kiska went on until August 1943. American commanders were already thinking about new targets. That's why the Battle of the Aleutian Islands is sometimes called the Forgotten Battle. After the Solomon Islands were safe, the United States started its push toward Japan itself. One aircraft carrier after another came out of the shipyards. In 1943 alone, the U.S. Navy launched 6 new carriers of the Essex class. These were huge ships, about 270 meters long, with a crew of over 2,600 men. They were like floating airports that could hold 80 to 100 airplanes. The ships passed through the Panama Canal into the Pacific Ocean, where they were grouped into powerful carrier fleets. In November 1943, Operation Galvanic was launched. The goal was to capture the Gilbert Islands. This was an important chain of small islands on the line between the North and South Pacific. The U.S. brought a massive force for this mission. 17 aircraft carriers and 10 battleships gathered near the Gilbert Islands, along with many cruisers, destroyers, and troop transport ships. A huge fleet of tankers and cargo ships supplied this giant battle group. Galvanic was the start of an island hopping strategy by the American military. This idea had actually been written down in a plan called War Plan Orange, way back in 1919, just in case there was ever a war with Japan. The first goal of the operation was to land on Tarawa, a tiny island with an airfield on its western side, called Betio.